Good evening. Welcome to Roosevelt House. I'm Harold Holzer. I have the privilege of serving as the director of this place and home base for, as you know, as I'm sure many of you have heard, I see all the faces who have heard these stories, but sorry, it's raining, so you have to stay to hear it. The home base for Franklin Roosevelt's runs for governor and president, birthplace of the New Deal, and the kind of a private house divided that spurred Eleanor Roosevelt to a strenuous public life, even if only to get away from her mother-in-law. It was a good start. Anyway, thank you for braving the crazy weather to join us. Summer yesterday, winter today, but there's no climate change. And as you veterans of our programs know, we will have a discussion here in the auditorium, followed by a reception and a book signing to which you're all invited upstairs in our Four Freedoms room, which is, as you no doubt remember, is the dining room that Franklin and Eleanor and Sarah Roosevelt shared as their public place. Before we begin, and I've neglected saying this at our first programs of the season, if you have a device that makes any kind of noise, please check it and turn off the sound. If we get through one program without a phone ringing, I'm going to insist that Clay get the news to the Metro desk at the Times, because it's going to be a real story. So I'm glad we're emphasizing the Eleanor side of the family tonight, because we so often focus on FDR and his family and his presidency. No apologies there. But whenever we can, we like to remind ourselves and our guests what Eleanor built for herself, her family, her political party, and eventually the cause of human rights around the world, beginning with her first stirrings of civic responsibilities when she was a resident of this house and went down to the Lower East Side to volunteer in settlement houses. Whatever the reason, the initial motivation for her fleeing the confines of the house, we are always grateful to Sarah Delano Roosevelt for building this now sacred space. Delayed wedding and Christmas present in 1908. As you know, before they moved in, Franklin and Eleanor were married on St. Patrick's Day, 1905, and the best man for the ceremony was, of course, Eleanor's uncle Theodore, the President of the United States. And I think the reason they scheduled it on St. Patrick's Day is because they knew the irresistible lure of a parade for Teddy was as compelling as his niece's wedding. And Teddy is the subject of tonight's discussion. Really less than a decade before giving Eleanor away up at a double townhouse near the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that's the place that inspired Sarah to devise the idea of a double townhouse for her son. She was married in Eleanor and Franklin were married in a mother and son double townhouse up in the 70s. And within 4 years of, they were 4 years of the wedding, they were ensconced here, and then 7 years later, of course, Franklin broke with Theodore, his hero, to support Woodrow Wilson for president. So it's an interesting arc from San Juan Hill, which I'm sure we're hearing a great deal about tonight, to the wedding, and to FDR's establishing himself firmly as a Wilson Democrat. I found one interesting thing for the record that I wanted to share, and I'm sure I will not cover ground that our guests will. Eleanor, for one, saw a link between her uncle and her husband, even though they were no closer than Sagamore Hill is to Hyde Park. So 63 years ago, almost to the day, Eleanor published one of her My Day columns, striking out at a critic who had accused FDR of having a mollycoddle philosophy, that he was a pampered person who wanted to, and why was he mollycoddled? Because he wanted to do social safety net programs for people. Comparing that to Theodore Roosevelt's strenuous life theory of life. Well, Eleanor got her back up. She had just come back from church with Franklin and on a very crisp day in Hyde Park, and she noted that we all pulled our coats up. It was so brisk, but Franklin was riding without a coat, just facing the winds, and she wanted everyone to know that while Theodore preached the strenuous life to keep yourself physically, mentally, and spiritually well, the ultimate objective before any other was what my husband believes in, making a home secure for your family. And she said of her husband, no man who has brought himself back from what might have been an entire life of invalidism to strength, activity, physical and mental and spiritual, can ever be accused of preaching or exemplifying a mollycoddle philosophy. So don't mess with Eleanor. Interesting dynamic there. Well, we will leave the discussion of whether the strenuous life was more strenuous for Franklin or for Theodore to our guests, and it's a pleasure not only to have Eleanor's family at the center of the discussion tonight, but to have two such fabulous experts on hand. Our special author guest is Clay Risen, who was the deputy op-ed editor of the New York Times and has worked in the history field as well. He is also the author, aside from the book we're going to talk about tonight, of A Nation on Fire, America in the Wake of the King Assassination, and The Bill of the Century, The Epic Battle for the Civil Rights Act. I got to know Clay when he ran the award-winning Civil War blog site Disunion for the New York Times, which posted hundreds of pieces over a 4-year period chronicling each day of the Civil War from the perspective of what happened exactly 150 years before publication date. And Clay was nice enough to ask me to write a few pieces, not enough, I should say, but a few. And it was great fun, and they did a book version as well. And to my surprise, I always discover something especially interesting when I prepare for these talks. Clay is also an expert on spirits. He would have had a great relationship with Franklin, who of course ended Prohibition. Not the kind of spirits that haunt houses, the imbibing kind. And I mean an expert. He is the author of Single Malt, A Guide to the Whiskies of Scotland, and a bestseller called Whiskey, Bourbon, and Rye, A Guide to the Nation's Favorite Spirit. Had I known this, we would have had more than wine and cheese tonight, but we will have to satisfy ourselves with that. And so the fact that Clay continues to work at the Times, helps produce the op-ed page, writes books about American history, drinks, has a wife and 2 children, and commutes from Brooklyn every day. So I think it's a bit like going up San Juan Hill every morning, and he does it. So we're grateful he's taken more time to talk to us about another proponent of the strenuous life and his brand new book, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. Clay will have the perfect interlocutor today, and those of you who attend our history programs will remember that we welcomed Patricia O'Toole last year to discuss her most recent book, The Moralist, A Life of Woodrow Wilson, which she presented here. She's also the author of When Trumpets Call, Theodore Roosevelt After the White House, and she's working on a book about TR's contributions to the social safety net, which will be an intriguing thing to have you back to discuss whenever. So keep at it. So this is a match made in heaven. An expert in TR's post-presidency in conversation with an expert on his pre-presidency. Please join me in welcoming Clay Risen and Patty O'Toole.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Harold. Can you hear me all right? I tend to be microphone shy, and it drifts like this, so haul me back if I do that. I'm really so glad you invited me to do this. It's fun to come back to Roosevelt House, and I loved Clay's book. I got to know him before this book came out. He edits a wonderful series in the Times. It's about 1919. Perhaps you've seen some of these pieces. And I wrote one of them for him about Theodore Roosevelt. It coincided with the anniversary of the centennial of his death, January 6th, 1919. And I hope that some of you all ought to aspire to write for Clay, because he's a wonderful editor. He asks penetrating questions about what you've written, and he can tighten things up without maiming your sentences. And he's really a genius at fine-tuning the balance between narrative and exposition, which is key in writing any kind of narrative, because otherwise it's just like there's too much weight on the narrative. It's like paddling a canoe in a swamp full of lily pads where you just can't make any progress. And not only that, he brings these virtues to his writing, I think. This book is so smart. It's so concise. He doesn't leave you wondering about what he thinks about anything. You're not sitting there thinking, oh, I don't know about that. And it moves like the wind. So we're going to have a lot of fun, I think, talking to him. So welcome, Clay. I'd like to start by asking you to remind us what the Spanish-American War was all about. Why did we get into this?
Certainly. And first of all, thank you, Patty, for those very kind words. It's a real honor to hear that from you. I've loved your work for so long.
So easy. I didn't even have to write. They just flew out.
And thank you, Harold, for having me here. This is just a wonderful place to do an event. So the Spanish-American War, brief conflict, obviously, between the United States and Spain in 1898. It was, one of the funny things, and it's just to make this a bigger answer than you probably maybe you expected, is, scholars these days, they actually call it the Cuban, Spanish, American, Filipino War, or some version of that. Because when we think of it as just the period when the United States engaged with Spain. But there had already been a war going on, began in 1895, which itself kind of picked up from a previous 10 years war. These were revolutions or revolts by Cubans against the Spanish colonialists. And Spain had been in control of Cuba for 400 years. And so, and the conditions in that war were such that they motivated a lot of Americans to really pay attention to what was going on there. I mean, they were pay attention to what was going on in the world. And one of the things I try to underline in the book is that for a lot of people, and a lot of people had different reasons for wanting to go to war to kick Spain out of Cuba, but one of them was a humanitarian motivation in a way that feels, I was very struck when I was doing the research for the book and reading some of the coverage and some of the commentary pushing, advocating for war, how much of it felt very modern. I mean, you could swap out a few words and it would have been someone calling for the invasion of Iraq in 2002. This kind of idea that, no, we have an obligation as Americans to go in and use our power for good. So there were a lot of other things, and we can talk about some of those, a lot of other motivations, but suffice to say that in April of 1898, finally, President McKinley, who had really resisted going to war, was himself not a particularly militaristic individual. Unlike Theodore Roosevelt, he did not believe that we needed a large military. He didn't want to be using the military to project America into the world. But he finally gave in to the pressure and declared war on Spain. The war moved very quickly. We sort of incidentally captured the Philippines in a bizarre sort of turn where we'd originally gone into the Philippines, sent our ships to the Philippines just to defeat a Spanish naval squadron that was there, just so that squadron didn't then attack California. It was all this sort of protecting our flanks. It was all about Cuba, really. But we ended up defeating the Spanish in the Philippines. The Spanish gave up the Philippines. We didn't want the Germans, believe it or not. The Germans really wanted the Philippines. We didn't want them to have it. And suddenly we were in control of the Philippines, which was a pretty nice side benefit from the perspective of American imperialists. Wow, suddenly we have the Philippines. So that turned into a revolt by the Filipinos against American. American was essentially American colonial control, and we ended up doing some of the same things, some of the same sort of gross human rights violations that we had accused the Spanish of committing in Cuba, including most famously the water torture, or the what do they call it?
Water cure.
The water cure,
Yes.
right? The water cure, and tens of thousands of Filipinos died. Also, many more American soldiers died in the Philippines than died in Cuba. But the upshot was, certainly by the end of what we call the Spanish-American War, in December of 1898, Spanish were out of the Western Hemisphere. We were in control of Cuba. We were in control of Puerto Rico, and then also Guam and the Philippines. So really, overnight, America went from being a country that may have had imperialist, expansionist aspirations in some corners, suddenly had all of these things very quickly. And so it left us with a lot of questions about, well, what does that mean? Where do we go with that?
Okay, there.
Yeah.
Now you have it
Now
for
you
the
have it.
exam.
Yeah.
So, like, you're all set. Do you think it was a necessary war? I've heard Cuban historians say, listen, if you guys hadn't come, we would have worked out our own destiny. Filipinos, same kind of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's funny, if you go, when I was researching the book, I went down to Santiago, where all the fighting, the American invasion took place in southeast Cuba, so around Santiago, and for a variety of reasons, that's why we went there instead of Havana. But so there's, and actually on San Juan Hill, where the famous battle took place, there is kind of a monument complex. It's a park, and clearly built long before the communist revolution in Cuba. A lot of it obviously built by American veterans groups, and there's a monument to the Rough Riders and a monument to the Michigan 71st and different regiments. But there's also a modern plaque or a post-revolution plaque, and it says in Spanish something to the effect of, we were winning this war, but it was really terrible, and we would have won anyway, but the Americans came in and it made it shorter. And so we're kind of happy they did, but we didn't really need them. And I think that is the Cuban perspective. I'm torn on that, because I think that the Spanish, look, one thing to keep in mind is that Spain had been in control of Cuba for longer than there had been permanent settlements, European settlements in North America. Yeah. Santiago is the oldest city, the oldest Spanish city in the Western Hemisphere. Havana, at the time, was the second largest Spanish city. It was also the last, besides Puerto Rico, it was the last holding in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish had a deep, deep connection to Cuba. Whether the Cubans liked that or not, because they didn't like it. And there were generations and generations of Spanish who had never been to Spain, right? So there were people who said, no, I'm Spanish, I'm not Cuban, I'm Spanish, but I've never been to Spain. My parents have never been to Spain. Generations. So there was a deep commitment there. And the idea that the Cubans, after 3 years, were on the verge of kicking those Spanish out. I mean, essentially, it was a stalemate, very much like Vietnam, or the American war in Vietnam, where the Spanish, like the Americans, more or less controlled most of the cities, but everything outside of that was controlled by rebels. And was that going to go anywhere? It's hard to see that resolving itself. But then I think by 1898, the Spanish were also looking for an excuse to leave. And one of the reasons I think the war went as easily as it did was because the Spanish were just waiting for that excuse to say, okay, we did our best, and now we're quitting. The Americans never attacked Havana, never attacked the western part of Spain, or western part of Cuba. We essentially made an effort, and the domino fell. So it's one of those counterfactuals that's impossible to say, but it's hard to see it just ending as quickly as it did. And that's important because tens of thousands of people are dying every couple of months in Cuba. I mean, even the conservative estimates of how many people died in concentration camps, mass executions, just rural starvation, 100,000 people outside of battle deaths. So it was a terrible war. It was a really terrible war. So it matters that maybe eventually the Spanish would have left. But I think it's very important that the Americans did go in when they did.
Okay. What about the Philippines? Was it? Well, that was the accident.
Terrible.
Yeah,
that was
the
a
accident.
terrible event. And it's one of those things. It's funny when you think about America today. We make tons of mistakes, of course, but we are this we have an enormous State Department and Pentagon and this huge foreign policy military apparatus. And we, if nothing else, we have a really good idea about what the world is like. We don't understand it necessarily, but we know what's going. We had no idea what we were doing in the Philippines, except that we get there and a certain number of people, and like Lodge and others who were and Roosevelt, who were adamant expansionists, were very happy with that. But a lot of people, McKinley and Roosevelt maybe to some extent even, said it's sort of a tiger by the tail situation. Suddenly we're in this grand strategy sort of great game conflict that we never wanted to be in. But we have the Philippines, and if we leave the Philippines, Germany's going to get the Philippines. And all of a sudden, this is what we never wanted to do, was to be in a situation where we're playing this chess game with a European power. The whole point of the United States was not to be doing that. So, yeah, I think that the Philippines is this really great example of sort of the tragedy of American foreign policy. And it happened so early in that 20th century period of American expansion, and yet we didn't learn from it, which is also, I think, the double tragedy.
That's a really wonderful summary of how we got to be this hegemonic power in the 20th century. This really is the origin story, right, to that? Now, going to TR, you all came here to hear about the Rough Rider, I'm sure. I was down at his birthplace today looking at his uniform from this war. They also had his alleged shirt that he was wearing when there was an assassination attempt in 1912, but there's no bullet hole in the shirt, so I have my doubts about this. Anyway, so we could say, maybe this wasn't a necessary war, maybe it had untoward consequences. It was certainly a necessary war for Theodore Roosevelt, right? Why? Why was it so important to him? He couldn't imagine not going. Yeah. He'd just become a father for the 6th time. He had 6 children. His wife was ill, and he was determined to go to this war, even though he thought he might die. What is that all about?
So I think it's there are 2 levels, right? First of all, I think he thought, maybe 3 levels, but one, he thought the war was necessary for the United States, and not just in a we have to go kick out the Spanish, save the Cuban sort of way. It was this sort of more, he saw war as a purifying, emasculating, it would, for him, there was this crisis in American life that needed something, needed a war, needed violence on a national scale, a national project of violence to kind of revivify the American body
politic. We were
politic.
getting soft. Industrialism was making us soft.
Yeah, and so for him, and it's his writings in the 90s, 1890s, are they're full of this kind of stuff of just, we need a war with somebody. We need, maybe we'll have a war with Germany. It was, and setting aside what that would get us, just the act of war was really important. And so, he had been pushing McKinley. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, and he had been pushing McKinley personally, lobbying him to go to war, and as well as sort of telling everybody who would listen to him, we need to have a war. Whether it mattered that it was in Cuba and not somewhere else, I'm not sure, but he was in this place where he could suddenly exert influence on Washington decision-making, and he did his best. So then when the war happened, he felt it was absolutely necessary that he go join it. So he was 38 years old at the time, and like you said, 6 children, 1 had just been born, his wife was sick, and yet he felt the need to go off and fight. Now, I think, like with everything with Roosevelt, there's not one answer, and there are multiple answers, none of which are necessarily mutually exclusive. The one that he gave to, the one that he would like history to remember, is that he felt that after all of his pro-war activism, that he couldn't sit by and not go to war. That he had to go. He couldn't be an armchair general. And I think he believed that. I think that he honestly felt that that was the case. That he had to go find a way not just to be a part of the war, but to actually go fight. And that's important because he very easily could have just gone and worked on the staff, taken a staff job in the War Department. He could have joined a regiment that very very obviously was never going to get sent to Cuba, but instead he militated to go fight in Cuba. And that doesn't mean that he didn't want glory. I think he did, and political gain, and that was the best way to do it. I think he probably could have gotten that all out of staying stateside, but so there was also something else, and I think that for him, ultimately, there's this bloodlust that he carried with him for most of his life, and it was born of, I don't know, something that was always with him, something that emerged from his childhood of trying, doing what his father said to sort of build himself as a man, about his ideas about masculinity. But it was very important that he go off and do something very violent, right? And not just hunt and not just box, but actually get involved in a human-to-human life and death conflict. That there was something very important and visceral that had nothing to do with his career, and it had nothing to do with his moralism. It had to do with just what he wanted, what he, at a fundamental level, thought he needed to do to be a full human being. It's something that's very it's strange, I think, sometimes to think about this. One of the things that's fascinating about him is that he's someone he was so well read, so intelligent, so worldly in a lot of ways, so accomplished, especially as president, in terms of building the modern state, building his ideas about global peace, about he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and yet at the core of it is this very animalistic, very violent sense of himself.
His idea, like the highest thing that a man could be, in his view, was a soldier, and the highest thing that a woman could be was a mother. And he often puts those two ideas in the same sentence. And men must not shirk their duties to be willing. They have to be willing to give their lives for their country, and women must not shirk motherhood.
Well,
both,
yeah,
it was a pair for him. These two things.
Well, and he spoke about women as, that there was it was in almost militaristic terms, like that is women being soldiers. Like that's somehow
Yes.
the same sort of visceral activity. It's very weird guy. That's all I can say.
So, do you remember how many troops in all American troops went to Cuba? And what percentage of that the Rough Riders were?
Yeah, so it was about 16,000 in the initial wave of American soldiers. Now, ultimately, a lot more went, but 16,000. There were about 600 Rough Riders who went to Cuba. There were about 1,000 total, but when they got everybody together in Tampa, this is how unorganized the American military was. They didn't have any ships. So they had to lease ships, most of which were not designed or outfitted for human transport. They were outfitted for coal transport, or a lot of them were for carrying animals. And so they had to be retrofitted very quickly, and the men all had to be down in these stinky, dirty holds for days. But even then, they didn't have enough, so they had to leave almost all the horses. And remember, the Rough Riders were a cavalry regiment. And they trained with horses. But when they went to Cuba, only the officers had horses. So if you ever see a painting, and there are paintings depicting the charge up Kettle Hill by the Rough Riders, if you see one, or if you see the movies, there are movies that have been made about this, and if you see movies where the men are on horses, it is just so fun. How you could screw that up did not happen. Roosevelt had a horse, but no one else did. Anyway, that's my beef with the movies, but a lot of paintings and a lot of just kind of the recreation. It goes to sort of one of the points in the book about the the automatic mythologizing of the Rough Riders.
Why did that happen? Why did they get all the ink?
Well,
If there's 600 of 16,000.
yeah. So one is Roosevelt was just a compelling. Roosevelt was not the world-striding national figure that he became very quickly after this. This kind of helped make him, but he was well known. He was a figure that was relatively familiar to most people in America, or to a lot of people in America, particularly readers. He's a very prolific writer. But you know, his the people that he brought together, the whole idea behind the Rough Riders was we didn't have enough troops. We didn't have enough regular troops. Regular volunteer, the traditional volunteer regiments would take so long to train that we couldn't really rely on them. So Roosevelt's idea was, why don't we get together some regiments of men who may never have been soldiers, but they have certain skills. They're like that Liam Neeson movie, The Taken, or what is that? What it's called? Yeah, where he says, "I have, I'm a man with certain skills," or whatever. So cowboys or police officers or miners or college athletes. The first and second, the number one and the number two tennis players in the country quit tennis to become Rough Riders. And Roosevelt himself and his colonel, his best friend, one of his best friends, and the colonel of the regiment, Leonard Wood, they hand-selected all of these men. Tens of thousands applied for the job, or applied to be Rough Riders. So there was this. So immediately, it was just sort of a great media story. So you have all these reporters who they already know who Roosevelt is. They're looking for a great kind of human interest story around the war. And, I mean, think about it. What a great story. So you get all these Fifth Avenue rich kids, and you put them together with these mythical, most of them were not cowboys, and most of the Westerners, you had lawyers from the West, but Westerners who could kind of be depicted as these cowboys. By 1898, the cowboy was already a mythical figure. The era of the cowboy was already over, but so Americans out in the East loved to think of what cowboys were. So you bring them together, and you throw them into an army that desperately needs help, and you're gonna train them and then send them into the face of battle. That's just such a compelling story, and it contrasted with what people thought of as soldiers. So in 1898, to be a soldier, before the war, let's say the Civil War to Spanish-American War period, to be a soldier was to be one step up from a convict. It was the worst job you could have, and it was the job that you didn't want anyone in your family to be a soldier, and you, if you were a soldier, it meant that you had just failed at everything in life. And soldiers were, a lot of towns out west, there weren't many. There were only 26,000 soldiers. And it was by law limited to that size. And most of them were spread in tiny units across the west, or maybe along the coasts. Towns that had garrisons, a lot of them had sundown laws, so soldiers had to be in the forts by sundown. A lot of them, in a lot of states, soldiers who were not native residents of that state were disenfranchised. It was a negative thing. And now here come along the Rough Riders, and they're sort of the opposite of all of that. And they're these sort of great citizen soldiers who have put down their glorious lives, and they're volunteering to go fight. So it attracts all this media, all the great reporters at the time wanted to follow the Rough Riders because they knew that was the story. So it becomes this virtuous cycle. So then everything the Rough Riders did got reported back, and often in very glowing terms. And so that was the story that people followed. And even though there were lots of other stories from the Spanish-American War, that was the one that people wanted to hear. And Roosevelt, being a great media manipulator, knew right off the bat. He hated the name Rough Riders, for example. But the press had decided, well, that's the nickname. The official name was the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. No, we'll call them the Rough Riders. Roosevelt hated that name. He said, no, that sounds silly. That's a terrible name. I want it, we're official. We're real soldiers. And the press kept calling it that. And very quickly he said, no, I'm not going to fight them on this because they really like me. And I think that works. So he's very savvy about that and working the right reporters. and just using it to both build himself up, but also to build up kind of his ideas about the war and where he thought the war and the military should go.
Was he on the battlefield a good leader, do you think?
I think he was a really good leader. Certainly the men thought so. And, one of the things that marked him as a good president marked him very well on the battlefield, which was a decisiveness. He was someone who didn't think twice about what needed to be done, about where different parts of the regiment should go. He learned very quickly. Leonard Wood, the colonel, and his friend was a veteran. He had fought in the Southwest during the Geronimo campaign. He was knew his way around a battlefield and around soldiers. But Roosevelt picked up how to be a soldier and how to be an officer very quickly. I think one thing that I argue in the book is that one of the things that really made him was not his performance on the battlefield, which was as estimable as it was. It was what he did outside the battlefield. And of course, those things reinforced each other. So when he got the Rough Riders organized in San Antonio, and they trained at trained just outside the city. And when Roosevelt arrived, the main hotel, the big hotel in town, which is still there, the Menger Hotel, the management said, well, you're Theodore Roosevelt. You can stay with us for free, and every morning you can go out and see the soldiers and come back and get a bath and have dinner with us, and we'll just put you up. And he said, no, absolutely not. I will, wherever my men are sleeping, that's where I'll sleep. I won't do anything they're not doing. Whatever they're doing, I'm going to do this well. And of course, he made sure that everybody heard that story very quickly, right? Because he is right. But it made for a very persuasive case that this man, who not only was not a soldier, was not a Westerner, despite his aspirations otherwise, is this Eastern college boy, rich kid. He shows up. He's 5'8". He's got thick glasses. He had a kind of a high pitch to his voice. These men were not necessarily persuaded that this is a guy just by looking at him, and he's dressed pretty nicely. But then they start hearing, he was offered a spot at the Menger, and he stayed with us. Whenever we do drills, he's right there with us. So and that's the kind of thing that he kept doing all the way through Cuba, and it really made everyone feel like he was willing to do whatever he told them to do. And then when it got to the battlefield, he did those things. And so he was one of the first ones charging up the hill at Kettle Hill. And then when he got to the top of Kettle Hill, and they looked over at San Juan Hill and saw that the American forces over there were not quite to the top, and he said, okay, we've got to charge there. And he ran out in front of his men, and they didn't hear him. And so he turns back and he looks, and they're not with him. And he comes back. Come on, guys! But he was that kind of a leader on the battlefield, and it wasn't for show, and everyone knew it because they already knew that he was someone who was one of them.
One of the interesting things about him in this war is that he is he emerges as the great hero of the war and the great critic of the way the war was managed. So what did that do for him?
Well, I think it established him, and it's knowing him. It's not surprising, right? Because he is somebody who, first of all, who was very critical of the lack of preparedness throughout the 1890s. He was someone who constantly advocated for a larger military, a larger navy, a larger army, and so in some ways, yes, he went to war and he fought in it and gloried in it, but also used it as the exhibit A through Z of why the next step needed to be all the things he had been calling for. Now we've seen what happens when we're not prepared to go to war, when we don't have enough trained soldiers, when we don't have when we don't have logistics at all. There's one point where everyone is organizing at Tampa to ship out of Tampa, and there was a backup dozens of miles long of train cars because there's only one train line that went into Tampa, And the rail cars that were bringing everything, food and ammunition and clothing, they weren't marked. So no one knew where anything was. I mean, this is kind of basic stuff that, of course, today, the Army is a model of efficiency by design. It was nothing of the case. So Roosevelt sort of very, very quickly used it as an opportunity to say, I know, and he could say, I know this firsthand in a way that no one else does, right? Or no one else who didn't, anyone who didn't fight, you don't know what I'm talking about. And I think it also allowed him to then be that kind of insider iconoclast, insider outsider that he liked to be, someone who was both had all of the qualifications to be on the inside and could be in the establishment when he wanted to be, but then also stand outside it and say, no, you all are wrong, and I feel confident enough to be independent and to call you all out on what you're doing. And I think, if you look at his presidency and his post-presidency, that's so much of his strategy, that's so much of his approach to everything, is when it's, he can be inside, he can be outside as the case calls for.
Yes, he's always looking for the middle of the road in a way to bring the extremes together.
Yeah.
So he he thought he deserved a Congressional Medal of Honor, and he didn't get it. What happened?
I mean, it's
Do you
hard.
think he deserved one? Congressman Risen?
Did he deserve one? I'm going to pass on that.
Okay.
I mean, it's no. I mean,
That's
it's hard.
fine.
It's hard to say. I don't think it was a dishonor to the medal that he eventually got one. I think it's interesting. This is one of those cases where Roosevelt undermined his own case because, immediately when he got back, that's what he wanted. And he lobbied very hard for it in a way that was very unbecoming of a soldier. And this is one of the things where, you think, oh, he really learned how to be a soldier. But actually, no, he didn't learn the humility and the need for self-effacement that is typically what comes with being a Medal of Honor winner. Someone who says, no, I don't deserve this. I was only fighting. And instead, Roosevelt made a very public effort, lobbying very hard for the Medal of Honor. And at the same time, he was in a public relations war with the Secretary of War, Alger. Alger really didn't like Roosevelt. Roosevelt really didn't like Alger. And at one point, partly because Roosevelt had right out of the gates, as soon as even before he left Cuba, was already criticizing the War Department and how it had prosecuted the war. And then when he gets back to the United States, he says, oh, Alger, my men fought so well, I want you to send us to Puerto Rico. At the time, there was this expectation that, there's going to be another very difficult fight in Puerto Rico. It ended up not being that difficult. But he said, no, we've got to go fight. You've got to let us. And Alger, started, and then Alger used that to then go public and say, look, Roosevelt is this peacock. He's just dancing around. He wants everything for himself. And that kind of framed what Roosevelt then did, come out and say, okay, well, I'm not going to Cuba, but I still want the Medal of Honor. I think that certainly the bureaucracy around that, whoever makes that decision, was not enamored of this man who now suddenly is a war hero. I mean, keep in mind that it's amazing that Roosevelt was even accepted as a soldier by the other officers. I mean, most of the other officers, some of them were Civil War veterans. I mean, there were men who had been in the military since their entire careers, and started at 18 and they'd gone off to fight, and now they were senior generals and colonels. And so they look at this guy and they think, who is this guy? And some of them were impressed by him, some of them liked him, but a lot of them looked at him and said, how come he gets all the credit? We've been doing this for 35 years.
Yeah.
And most of it in a country that really doesn't like us. And yet we went off to war and fought and, did pretty well. And that's where I come back to it, is as admirable as Roosevelt was, and I think as singular as some of his accomplishments were during the war, there were also a lot of other men who did pretty stellar things on the battlefield. And so the idea that Roosevelt should get it because he's famous, and General Hawkins, who led the charge up San Juan Hill, shouldn't get it because he's not famous, seems a little unfair.
And I was struck in reading his memoir of the Spanish-American War that he boasts about the high casualty rate in his regiment. What's that about?
I think that's the same. That's that same sort of visceral. Yeah, one of the things. It's funny. I mean, you talk about this some in when trumpets call, but just the way that Roosevelt he didn't want to die without any scars. There was this sort of I have to I need to be broken down in certain ways, and I think he felt that way about the regiment as well, both because it was an expression of himself, to say, see, this proves that I was in the middle of it, because not only were we fighting, but a lot of my men were dying, and so I get to no one can question that if anyone did. But I think also just this idea that this is what we collectively need to do. So in as much as the Rough Riders were for him, and he was very explicit about this, the Rough Riders were an expression of the best of America. And it's striking too, and this is a sort of side topic, but for Roosevelt, he always talked about the diversity of the Rough Riders, and it's interesting. Of course, it was all men, racially segregated, and yet for him there were other ways of talking about diversity that were more important in terms of class and region and whatever. But for him, suffice to say, he thought that the Rough Riders were this microcosm of America. And so for them to then be able to say, see, we won, but we were bloodied when we did it, and we came back with scars. That's what he wanted America to be like. And so, it's important on that level as well.
May I ask him one question about his writing, Harold? Harold is trying to get you home before midnight. I have no interest in that. I'm having a great time. Just about your writing, the Spanish-American War is a very complicated topic. I mean, it's contained, it's short, it just involved a few people, and it had these big consequences, and so in some ways it doesn't seem very complicated, but it is really complicated. And many long books have been written about it. You managed to write a pretty short book about it. It's quite attractive because it's so short, right? None of this Jill Lepore stuff, 700 pages. You can buzz through this in nothing flat. So how do you do that? I mean, when you're making decisions about what goes in and what gets left behind, how do you think about those things, whether it's characters or scenes or?
It's a good question. I mean, I think as a journalist, I'm trained to write very succinctly. So it's not even it's just muscle memory to write very quickly. I mean, to write very very briefly, and really just to sit down and say, what are the important points to bring through, knowing that. Yes, this is a book about the Spanish-American War, but it's not fundamentally, that's not front and center. The story, the experience of the Rough Riders and the experience of Roosevelt, that's the main thing. So what are the things that need to be brought in to tell the story of this war, and what can be left out? For one of the ways you can approach that is read all those long books and then sort of triangulate and figure out, well, what are the things that very clearly, at least the consensus agrees, is sort of the important elements to bring through, and what are just some ways to tell that. So early drafts of the book, I had a lot more about Cuba from 1895 to 1898, because I thought that was a really important precedent, and I still think it is, because that's something people don't know a lot about. But later I went back through and realized, it's a lot of material, and so then spent time culling all of that out. And, unfortunately, it does mean cutting a lot of, they say you want to cut the fat, not the muscle. And, as you go through, you realize that stuff you thought was muscle is actually fat. And so, you cut that out. I read and reread drafts. And specifically because over time, the things that start to wear on me, that's a good sign that it should come out. So everything when you write a draft, I'm sure everybody has had this experience. The first time you write something, you complete it. Oftentimes you feel like this is great. Every line in here is awesome, or it's very obvious what's not great, right? So I can cut out this and this and this. It's perfect. But then you read it 2 or 3 more times, or you set it aside and you come back to it and you go, yeah, I don't really love that sentence anymore. I don't really like, I did. I used to think it was great. This other sentence is fantastic. But that's that's where you say, okay, that can go. Or you realize, hey, I'm kind of saying 2 things 5 times. Can I cut that back? Even though they're all great, even all these elements are really fantastic. I had this whole, Richard Harding Davis is one of the supporting characters in the book. He was the most famous war correspondent. And he had made a trip to Cuba before the war started to kind of get a sense. It was funded by William Randolph Hearst. And he had been sent to kind of figure out what's going on. And so I had a lot about him, too. Because he has this his reporting trip is full of great material, and it's a great way to talk about it. But over time, I read that 5 or 6 times and realized it's not that interesting. It is. It's interesting, but it doesn't belong in the book. And so that, for me, is how it goes. And so, it's there's a certain amount of humility to it, but also just wearing yourself down. And over time, I think of books sometimes, I like to think of books as sort of the way that I am not an artist by any means, certainly not a sculptor, but the way that some sculptors talk about the sculpture already exists in the rock. It's just a matter of removing all the parts that are not sculpture. And sometimes I think of a book that way, right? That the story's there. The story is there. The things I want to say are there. Maybe it's on my head. Eventually it's all in text. And then it's just a matter of removing everything that is not that. And struggling, trying to figure out what that is the heart of, I think, getting a book right.
So there you have the formula for a really good book, removing everything that is not that.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a great
Easy
place.
but tricky.
Easy but tricky, yes. That might be a good place to turn to audience questions. We could? Over there? Yes? Oh, we have to, I'm sorry. We wait for a microphone here.
In high school history, we learned that what the spark was for starting the war was the sinking of the Maine. Yet you never even mentioned it today. Was it that important or not?
Yeah, it was important in the sense that it, like you said, it was a certain spark. It heightened tensions over Cuba. The background, we all have probably heard of the sinking of the Maine, but the background is that the United States, McKinley, had been trying to get Cuba to leave, had been trying through diplomatic means to get Spain to leave Cuba. And he sent the USS Maine, it was a battleship, it was a cruiser, down to Havana Harbor in early 1898 as a way to just say, hey, we have a navy, and we have ways of making you do things. And on one night, the Maine exploded, and hundreds of sailors were killed, and very quickly, people jumped to the conclusion, although not all, and in fact, a lot of Americans didn't, but many people jumped to the conclusion that Spain had blown it up. One of the things that I found that was interesting, that happened in February. We didn't declare war until the end of April, and really things died down. McKinley didn't believe that Spain had attacked, or really bore any responsibility for what had happened. There was a lot of mainstream opinion that said that would be, why would Spain do that? Why would they attack? Roosevelt always said, well, it probably wasn't the intention of Spain to do it, but A, it happened in their territory, so they're responsible, and it was probably a floating mine or something like that. But it became a rallying cry for certain sectors. The thing that really got Americans going was a combination of that and what they saw as Spain's sort of intransigence over the investigation, intransigence over just being unwilling to leave Cuba. So I think it's an important part of the context, but it's simplistic to say that that's why we went to war, even though, of course, that's what we're taught in the history books.
Yes, back over there. Yes.
Hi. During the Civil War, Teddy Roosevelt's father did not fight. He basically bought his way out. Wouldn't you say that Teddy had to sort of like bring honor to the name by being a war hero because he had this guilt complex about his father?
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt that was part of it. I mean, I think when you look at his motivations, the desire to, yeah, he worshipped his father in a way that is hard to overemphasize. He throughout his life thought he was the greatest human. So then to see him do this thing that, by all accounts, was, it was a little. I mean, other people did it. It wasn't like his father was uniquely cowardly, but it certainly ran against Roosevelt's own idea about what manhood should be, which his father embodied. So I think absolutely that there was probably some element of his martial spirit that was motivated by the idea by the idea that he had to make up for what his father had not done. So, yes.
Down here. Just 1 second. I seem to be picking all the people who are furthest from the mics.
I wonder if this machismo that you talk about him expressing through the war here didn't come from his going to the West when he was, after his wife and first child died, and he was suffering from asthma or something, and he went for 3 years. Wasn't he in the West building up himself?
He was back and forth. I mean, that's all. It's all part of the same thing, right? So you talk about his idea about his father and his worship of this man as the embodiment of American manhood, his love of the West. You mentioned his asthma. He struggled with asthma his whole life, even though part of his the myth that he told was that he beat his own asthma. He actually was asthmatic for most of his life. But to be fair, to give him credit, he did make him, and he was a fairly frail young person, and really built himself as a very strong, very self-reliant individual, often, starting with summers out in the Maine woods and mountain climbing, and then as a young adult, or in his 20s, going out west. And oh, absolutely. And his belief in the West as this land of testing the American metal is I think inextricable from where he then went with his ideas about American expansionism.
Way back there.
Really?
1 second.
Relating it to current times, the democratic imperial wars or imperial democracy, whatever you want to call it, the Wild West and the macho man, come 60s, Vietnam, Rambo, draft, last war where it was democratized military recruitment, some could get out of it. Bring forward today, the incessant, endless wars through this century, Afghan, Iraq, 17, 18 years. Nobody nobody drafted in it. The macho-ness is gone in terms of, drones, consumerism. Nobody is really singing virtues of war as a hero.
Yeah.
How do you see these threads I have seen only the Filipino-Cuban War
Yeah.
from the imperial perspective, but you are bringing very interesting aspects about the Teddies and other volunteers who did what they did and justified in those terms. Today, there is none of that. How do you see that? Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, I think there's a thread that runs through, and this is one of the reasons why this war, I think, is so important. And I think the Rough Riders, as a story, are so important within this war because it created this idea about what America's role in the world would be. And it's something that really has stuck with us even to today. And throughout the 19th century, Americans had struggled with what are we as a country and how do we fit into the world? And especially as America grew as an economic power after the Civil War, the question was, well, how do we assert ourselves in the world? We don't want to be like Europe. We exist because we don't want to be like Europe, and yet we want to be out in the world. We see benefits from doing that. We need to defend ourselves. So how do we differentiate ourselves? And the Spanish-American War resolved a lot of those questions because it said that we will be a force for good in the world. We will go out and we will intervene for humanitarian reasons. We will immediately, we occupied the Philippines and we kept it for bald geopolitical reasons. And yet the story right from the beginning was, no, we're here to help. We're going to stay here as long as it takes the Filipinos to learn how to rule themselves. If that takes 40 years, and according to us, it did, right?
Yeah.
But that was what America would do, and when you have that combined with an enormous military that we built during World War II and kept, you can do no wrong, right? And then every to a hammer, everything is a nail, right? It becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that we have to be out in the world, and that means we have to intervene in the world. But whatever we do is good, and that means however we do it is good. So Vietnam, we go into Vietnam, it's good. It's good what we're doing in Vietnam, right? We need to invade Iraq. And oftentimes the intentions are good, or some people's intentions are good. But there's no plan, and there's no thinking through of whether it's a good idea. And so that's what brings us, I think, all the way up to the present.
Over here, this gentleman, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Why was the United States so set against Germany positioning itself in the Philippines?
It's a good question. Germany was, Americans in the 19th century had a very interesting relationship with Europe and the way that they thought about Europe, right? So Britain was was sort of how do you say it? We were frenemies, right? They were the country we had revolted against, and yet they were the country that we had, at least certain Americans, had the closest cultural affinity with, right? Germans as well, because there were so many Germans who had come to the United States after the war. I mean, after the Revolutionary War and through the 19th century, a large percentage of the American population was German. And there was something else, though, where we looked to Britain and could, especially as America after the Civil War started to really grow and define itself, we could look at Britain and some of the more imperialistic or outward expansionistic Americans would say, well, or jingoistic would say, well, Britain is on the decline. I mean, we're going to outpace them. But Germany, remember, Germany was a late starter as well. Germany had been only unified in 1871, had really only come into its own as an imperial power at the end of the 19th century, and yet was someplace where, it was probably the only place in the Western world, at least, where Americans could look and say, yeah, they're doing the same thing we are. They're industrializing and urbanizing very quickly, and yet they are very eager to get out into the world. And so Germany was knocking around the Caribbean. Germany was occupying the last batches that they could in Southwest Africa, so the last patches of uncolonized Africa, and they were looking to colonize the Southwest Pacific. And so the United States looked to them and said, well, if we're going to have a war, it's going to be with Germany. And Roosevelt was one of the leading acolytes of that idea, or leading advocates. He said, if we have a war, it's going to be with Germany. And he was very prescient in that regard. He was also very prescient. He understood that we would probably fight Germany first, but in the long run, we will fight Japan. And he wrote this in the early 1900s, and he nailed it.
Yeah, down here. Just 1 second, okay?
Thank you. Very interesting talk. There's clearly a dichotomy in his character. On one hand, you could say he was very much of a warmonger. On the other hand, on a personal level, he fought for unions and fought against poverty and certainly the tenements of New York City when he was involved in New York City politics. So how would you characterize him? What was the greater driver? The need to do good or the need to be right?
That is such a good question, and I don't think that there's an answer. The answer is that that's what defines him, is that tension right there. I think that you have captured who is Theodore Roosevelt. It's someone who, a man who was driven by the tension between the desire to be right and the desire, the worship of might and the desire to be right, and the deep moralistic commitment to the greater good. And from his time, the earliest writings, his earliest career as a New York State Assemblyman, all the way up to the post presidency, and his campaign for the 1912 election. These were things that drove him, and it can't be resolved. There's no resolution. It's that, and people who look for an answer in one or the other, I think, miss the fact that what defines him is that undefinable tension.
Okay, I'm told we have time for one more question. How about right here?
Great question.
Okay, make it great.
Thank goodness.
It's the best.
Okay.
Now, I'm so interested in the Rough Riders because on the old television westerns, there are references and there are people on the Virginian. There's one episode devoted to the Rough Riders. My question is, are the Rough Riders the prototype for Merrill's Marauders in World War II, the Green Beret in Vietnam, and SEAL Team 6?
That's a good question. It's funny, actually, it's funny you mentioned the Virginian because Owen Wister, who wrote the Virginian, was a very good friend of Roosevelt and wrote a memoir of his life with Roosevelt. So these things come around. Look, one of the things that's fascinating about the Rough Riders is the career that the idea of the Rough Riders had after they came back. So when they came back, they were celebrities. They were worshipped. They landed, you may know this, they landed out on Montauk and were quarantined. And then they came into New York, and they couldn't pay for a drink. They couldn't pay for a hotel room. They couldn't pay for a Broadway show. Everyone wanted a piece of the Rough Riders. There was the fashionable hat for women that fall was called the Rough Rider. It was a sort of slouch hat, sort of inspired by a slouch hat. And another cool connection is, so one of the guys in the book, one of the Rough Riders, and I sort of follow him through the story, his brother-in-law was Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison loved the Rough Riders and immediately made a bunch of movies that, they were staged just, in New York, in empty lots in New York to show, this is the rush up San Juan Hill. And those were seen around. A bunch of the Rough Riders used their celebrity to join Wild West shows, that were some of the biggest entertainment of the year. Some were in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. There were a couple of others. So this all sort of echoes through. So immediately, and there were movies made through the 30s and 40s about what the Rough Riders did when they came back. And they joined. Some of them, they were cowboys. They went back to being cowboys. They went and fought on the border or whatever. So they left an imprint on the culture beyond what they did immediately afterward. And so to your question of did they then provide a model for Merrill's Marauders, the UDC, the underwater demolition folks who became the SEAL teams? Perhaps. There is this there is this idea with the American, and this is a whole other topic. Someone could write a whole book about the tension between the idea of the American soldier as a sort of, you follow the rules, you maybe you come from civilian life, but you follow the rules, and you fight alongside, and you're part of one. And this idea that no, the best soldiers always exist somehow outside the system. They're always Rough Riders or Merrill's Marauders or SEALs, where, yes, they're all fighting on the same team, but they operate by some other code. And, whether they're directly an inspiration, they're certainly a predicate to it. And I think they certainly are part of this idea that we have about what is and is not soldierly virtue in America.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Clay.
Please join me in thanking Patty O'Toole and Clay Reiser.